Welcome back everyone, this is Professor Chan. This video will be the last lecture of the semester because we're reaching to the last learning module. So in this learning module, we'll be covering some materials from chapter 17 and very little amount from chapter 18 as well. And in these two chapters, we'll continue our studies on the different market structures, right? In the past few weeks, chapter 15 and 16, we talk about the two extreme cases of different market structures, the perfect competition and the monopoly, right? And in chapter 17 and 18, we'll be focusing on another two market structures lying between monopoly and perfect competition. So we'll start from chapter 17, the monopolistic competition market. And for chapter 17, we will only be focusing on 17.1 and 17.3. So we'll spend time to compare the monopolistic competition to monopoly and perfect competition markets. And we'll also talking about one essential feature of a monopolistic competition market is that the advertising. Okay, so to start, we first need to learn about what are the characteristics of a monopolistic competition market, right? How do we determine whether, say, the market you chose for your project is a monopolistic competition market or not? And the three features, right, to identify a monopolistic competition is that first we need to have many sellers in the monopolistic competition market. And that means with those many sellers, they have to compete against each other so they could attract more customers, so they could grab more market share. And secondly, in the monopolistic competition market, we also have differentiated product. So that is unlike a perfect competition market, right? Where you have identical service and goods. But in here, because of this product differentiation, so the sellers, even though they have to compete with other sellers, right, they still have some market power because they have their brand, or sometimes they build this customer loyalty, so they can have this market power, or sometimes it's kind of a priority to charge higher or to maintain a certain market share. And for companies in a monopolistic competition market, what they usually do is that they focus on building those product differentiation, right, to build their brand. And the last main feature of a mono competition market is that we have free entry and exit in those markets. So this is kind of similar to, right, a perfect competition market. So based on those characteristics, you might have already noticed that mono competition has a lot of similarities comparing to the perfect competition, right? So maybe the main difference is that instead of identical goods, we have differentiated product. And let's think about what are examples of monopolistic competition markets. The example in the textbook are like books, right? When we go to, say, Barnes and Nobles, there are so many different types of books, right? Targeting at different readers. So we definitely have all those sellers, like different publishers. And there is definitely product differentiation in a book market, right? Because each type of book or each book, they will give you different information and knowledge. And there might be low barriers to entry or exit in the publishing industry. So we usually tend to consider books market as a monopolistic competition. And other good examples are like restaurants, right? Even in the smallest town in the world, you have like multiple restaurants is necessary. But each restaurant might have something that built their customer loyalty. So that's the differentiated part. And if you consider the barrier to enter or exit a like diner business as considered to be relatively low, right? Then maybe a high-tech industry or business, you do need some patents or you do need a research and developing team. But for restaurants, we consider there's less barriers, so it's more like a free entry or easy entry and exit. And other examples are maybe computer games, lessons, piano lessons, or food, groceries, clothing. Those are monopolistic competition industries. And before we proceed, right, with chapter 17, I would like to show you this graph to compare the different market structures we've been talking about so far. So on the left-hand side, we have a monopoly, if you guys can recall. Monopoly means there is only one supplier, one firm in the whole industry. So that's one extreme case. And on the other hand, on the right-hand side, we have another extreme case, the perfect competition market. When you have many firms in certain industry and those firms sell identical products, we consider those markets as a perfect competition market. And examples of perfect competition market tend to be those agricultural products, because the output of those industries tend to be identical, right? It's not that different from each other as maybe in the car market or computer laptops. As you could see on this graph, lying between monopoly and perfect competition, we have another two types of markets, right? Chapter 17 focuses on monopolistic competition, which is obviously closer to the perfect competition market, right? Because they both have many firms, they both have a large enough sellers pool so that the sellers have to compete with each other. And as a result, the sellers in those two markets, mono competition and perfect competition, both have less market power. And there is another type of market that is closer to monopoly, but is not as powerful as a monopolistic company, because we see a few firms sharing this market. Examples could be tennis balls and airlines, right? Whether you travel a lot or not, when you think about the airline industry, there could only be a few of names, right? And they kind of share the market together. Sometimes when they are colluding, they might even like cooperate with each other. So we'll elaborate on those in chapter 18. And from here, we'll be more focusing on the mono competition market, right? Where you have many firms, and the only difference between mono and perfect competition markets is whether we have differentiated products or identical products. Okay, now let's keep this chart in your mind, and let's move on to learn more about the monopolistic competition. So one of the most outstanding feature of a monopolistic competition market is that advertising. So consider if we're in a perfect competition market, say a wheat market, everyone's selling identical agricultural products, there is no point of advertising because buyers, they don't really care about where to buy or who they buy their wheat from, right? But for a monopolistic competition market, it's a little bit different because customers, buyers, they could identify the differences between products. Like when we're going to buy drinks, sometimes we might choose soda, sometimes we might choose juice or water or flavored water. We definitely have differentiated products to choose. And advertising will help customers to find what they want. So from the firm's perspective, advertising will help, right, the buyers to find their product. So in that sense, will attract more buyers to their business so that the firms can make more money. So following a study findings, for highly differentiated goods, 10 to 20% of the total revenue might be spent in just advertising or marketing activities. But for homogeneous products, then there is usually no need for advertising in that sense. So which kind of makes sense, right? If only my product is different from other competitors, then I would like to pay to market or advertise my product. Otherwise, probably other competitors will just be free riders of my advertising spendings if our products are still too similar to each other. Make sense? So the more differentiated the products are, the more firms are willing to pay for their advertising, and in return, they will earn more profit, right? Because now they have a larger market share. But there is also a debate, right, over advertising. Opponents argue that firms would advertise to manipulate customers' tastes, and they complain that commercials are usually not informational, might cultivate, right, irrational consumptions or create the demands that should not exist. And also, the opponents believe that advertising sometimes impedes competition because the more unique your product is, then the more market power you have, and probably you are going to charge a higher price. So in that sense, the customer's demand will be less and less elastic, right? Because they are more and more willing to pay more money to the uniqueness of your product. So I still remember when iPhone first came up, and that is so different from, right, the phone that we are used to, and people were really willing to pay a high price for the uniqueness. But there are also supporters of advertising for sure, right? And those scholars believe that advertising provides more information to our customers so that we could make better choices. And overall, if you think from the whole society's perspective, more information usually allows for more efficiently allocation of resources. So in that sense, the whole society could benefit from advertising due to the increased efficiency it provides, right? And due to more information being delivered between customers and the suppliers. And another reason, right, people do like advertising or pro-advertising is that this actually fosters competition in a sense, right? Say if we're in a market where there is one business tend to dominate this whole market, and we have maybe new firms trying to enter this market and they have only a very little market share, they could utilize the tool of advertising, right, to publicize their brand, publicize their products, so they can still have the chance to grab a market share. And in that sense, this advertising fosters, promotes competition. So it's not necessarily, right, bad. It has just two sides of the coin. It could sometimes hinder, sometimes promotes competition. And other people also see advertising itself, this behavior, this action itself, as a signal of product quality, right? So we tend to trust those big brands more who spend a lot of money in marketing, right? Because for them, they are already spending their money in the advertising. And if they have, say, quality issues, they could still easily lose their customers. So regardless of, right, how much information or how much useful, meaningful information is being delivered in each advertisement, regardless of all those, even this action of willing to pay for marketing is a signal of a maybe well-functional business, of a high quality, high product quality, right? So in that sense, as a monopolistic competition company, you might really need to consider, right, utilizing the tool of advertising. And lastly, we talk about a concept called the branding, right? So critics believes that, right, the whole branding thing is just a trick. The products are being right, being sold, whether it has a brand name or is generic, substitutes, they're not really different. They're not differentiated, right? The money you pay for certain brand names, that's not really worth it. I'm pretty sure you might have some like examples or names in your mind right now. But on the other hand, we also have defenders of branding, right? And those people believe that with the efforts to build a reputation, build customer loyalty, build the brand names, customers will tend to learn more about their product or the quality of their product, and the firms will be willing to do more to maintain, right, the good reputation, to maintain the customer's loyalty. So in that sense, again, customers or the whole society could still benefit from the advertising and branding activities. All right. So that's the chapter 17 I'm about to cover. And the last thing I want to go over is maybe a comparison, right, between the three markets we've learned so far. If we put perfect competition, monopolistic competition, and monopoly on this table, we can first start to think about what do they share in common, right? What do they have in common? They actually have a common goal. No matter what market they're in, we always want to maximize the profits. And the rule for profit maximizing is the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, and this holds for any markets. And in the short run, no matter what market you're in, you still have the chance to earn economic profits, right? As long as you have certain specialty, maybe you have lower costs, or maybe there is a market change, market shock, so that you could take advantage of a, say, growing buyer pool. So in the long run, you still have the chance to earn positive profit no matter what, positive economic profit. And moving on, we'll be thinking about what are the differences, right? If you compare the three markets, you would and ask the question about how much market power they each of the type have, right? Which means can they maybe decide the price they charge their customers? For a perfect competition market, they are price takers. Okay, they do not have any influence on the price. But for monopolistic competition and of course monopoly, those two markets, right, business in those two markets are definitely not price takers. They do have enough market power to influence their pricing strategies, which means, for perfect competition, they could only charge their price equals to marginal cost. But for monopolistic competition and the monopoly, they could totally charge higher price than their marginal cost. So in that sense, the more units they make, right, they could earn more basically. But there are also some features that perfect competition and monopolistic competition share, and both different from a monopoly business, right? Because in these two markets, we both observe a large number of firms, a large number of suppliers, and those suppliers have to compete against each other. And because they're more competitive, right? Both perfect and mono competition markets are considered to be more competitive due to this large amount of suppliers. And that means there is lower barriers or little barriers to enter those more competitive markets, right? So entry in the long run is available for those markets. But for monopoly is different. Monopoly is the only one firm, the only one supplier in the whole market. There is no entry in the long run because it might be reinforced by law, it might be backed by a unique patent or certain type of charter orders, right? So monopoly is always the only one. And if there is somehow new entries or maybe a antitrust law requires a monopoly to be separated, splitted, then that's not a monopoly anymore. That would be the oligopoly, right? We are going to talk about soon. So to summarize this chapter 17, and specifically 17.1 and 17.3, the two sections we're covering here, we focus on introducing the features of monopolistic competitive market, and we compare this market type to other market structures, right? And we also introduce the outstanding feature of a monopolistic competitive market, that is the advertising, right, is important. The firms have the incentives to do that, and they do benefit from advertising, and so do customers. So that's all about chapter 17. You might pause here if you want before we move on to chapter 18. And chapter 18 is about oligopoly. If you recall from the figure I showed earlier, where we have 4 different types of market, right? Oligopoly is right here. It's more like monopoly, except, right, instead of one firm, we have a small number of firms, not large enough to be considered as a monopolistic competitive market, right? So few firms is the main features of a oligopoly business. And because we'll be only covering a few key terms of this chapter, right? So I decided there will be no required readings for this chapter. I'll provide you with a video link. And I'll go over the key terms, right, in this chapter, in this lecture. But somehow I think if you would like to read about the chapter, I provide a list of optional readings, right? You could go ahead and read about the 18 1A, 1B, 1C, and 1D. And also we actually covered some materials from 18 2A and 18 2B as well. So these are a list of optional readings from your ManQ textbook. The main features of a oligopolistic business is that first, it has only a few, very few sellers, right? And second, in oligopolistic market, one firm's decision about whether their pricing or their output can actually affect other firms. So it's really important to take into account the actions, right, your competitors would take. In an oligopolistic market, if you guys ever heard of the term game theory, that is actually, rooted from this theory, this microeconomic theory right here. So studying the behavior of your competitor, right, and base your decision upon your competitor's choices or behavior is the main feature of an oligopoly. So from a customer's perspective, when you are in the market, when you're shopping at a market with only a few sellers, the least thing you want to see is that those few sellers, those oligopolists, they actually cooperate with each other and act like a monopolist, right? In that sense, they have all the market power. There is no competition between them. They're all against the customers and they can feel free to charge a high price, right? So in that sense, cooperation will make oligopolists monopolists. So think about if tomorrow when you wake up and go out and find that all the gas stations are now, right, they merged into one business, then they can charge whatever price they want, basically, right? Because they are the only one in the market. And if you want to drive, you have to buy gas from them, which is definitely not a good news for customers. So luckily, oligopolists, they don't always cooperate because they each have strong incentives, right, to pursue their very own best interest. So in that sense, they don't always agree to have a cooperative outcome. And a classic game theory would start with a duopoly. So that's the case when you have only two sellers in the market. So it's still not a monopoly because you have more than one sellers. And duopoly is considered to be the simplest version of oligopoly, right? And many game theory models are developed in the case of duopoly. So later on in this chapter, in this lecture, we'll be talking about the famous prisoner's dilemma. And that is actually an example of a duopoly. And when the worst scenarios for customers happens, right? When a few sellers in a certain market, in a In oligopolistic markets, they decide to cooperate. We call it sometimes when they agree on something, right? Like they could have a temporary agreement, or between countries, they could have maybe regional trade agreements, things like that. We call it a collusion, right? Or sometimes those group of firms could get together and can form a cartel. So that definitely needs more trust within the group, and it usually won't hold for too long. So in history, we have like the crude oil cartel, we have many other cartels in different industries in different countries, right? That's when a group of firms, right, who are producing similar products, who are in the same industry, decide to act in unison. So in that sense, they are pretty much just acting like a monopoly, right? They would decide together to decide how much to supply and like what is their output level, and also how much to charge their customers. And within the cartel, they would decide each share of production, right, regarding to each member of a cartel. So in the discussion of this module, learning module, you'll be thinking about the oil cartel. That is, right, still going on in today's world. And actually, earlier in April, you might have seen like a sudden jump of gas price. And that is due to a declared announcement from OPEC or OPEC Plus that they're planning to reduce the oil supply later this year. So obviously, collusion is so beneficial for each member of those colluded firms, right? But in reality, how come it's still hard to maintain a cartel or collusion or like trade agreements? And one explanation will be related to the famous prisoner's dilemma. And in the textbook, we call it the economics of cooperation, right? And this model will try to explain to you how come cooperation is so difficult to maintain, even when cooperation is mutually beneficial for each game players. So we all agree that when oligopolies, right, they form a cartel, they act as one business, and they try to go for the monopoly outcome, which is the most beneficial for each of them. We didn't take into account the situation that when, right, other people, other firms in cartel are following the agreements we discussed, but I cheat. That is actually a better situation than, right, just a cooperation. And this is a perfect and classic example of a prisoner's dilemma. So before we move on to the next page and learn about the prisoner's dilemma and a concept called a Nash equilibrium, I think it's important to go over a concept, a keyword called a dominant strategy. That is, when a firm or a player in a game are facing a set of options, right, at least two or more, if there is one strategy, one option that is just strictly better than others, regardless the strategies that other players might choose, right? If there is one option, one strategy that is just the best, then we call it a dominant strategy. And let's see how that would help us understand the game of prisoner's dilemma. So before you continue with this video, I highly recommend you to check out this YouTube video, because I am actually borrowing an example from this video about the prisoner's dilemma. So you can feel free to pause right now. And in the example used, right, by this Instant Egghead YouTube channel, they have two players in a game. Okay, one is Xavier, and he's supposed to be the guy who dressed blue. So I use this blue color, right, to represent Xavier. And Yoshi is this guy in red shirt. Okay, so now consider they're both arrested, right? And they're separated, and they each face the risk of being imprisoned. And the rule of the game is only when they're both confessing, right, they will be charged and they will be put in prison. And if one confesses and the other one remains silent, then the prisoner who didn't confess, who remained silent, will be put in jail. And the person who confessed will actually be free. So here's the rule for both of the players, right? If you take a look at the case when, say, Xavier confesses and Yoshi decide to remain silent, so these are the two options for Yoshi, remain silent are two options for Xavier, okay? And when Xavier chooses to confess, right? So that's we're looking at these two cases, right? When Xavier chooses to confess, one of these two cases, and if Yoshi remains silent while Xavier confesses, then Yoshi will be the person to be put in jail and Xavier will be free. Okay, the same for Yoshi. If Yoshi decides to confess, so we're looking at these two cases, and Yoshi confesses and Xavier remains silent, so in that case, only Xavier will be charged and Xavier will be put in jail, and Yoshi will be freed. So it sounds like telling on other will be a great idea, because if they remain silent, then I'll be freed. But in fact, when they both choose to confess, they're actually facing 8 years of imprisonment for each, which is actually a bad idea, right? And actually, the best choice for each of them is to both remain silent, so none of them will be put in jail. Instead, they will be charged some minor crime or minor offense, and they would only be imprisoned for like 1 month for each of them. So if you compare, right, the different cases, instead of both confess, they better both remain silent. But the Nash equilibrium of this game is actually when both choose to confess. And why is that? Why they don't cooperate, right? They both remain silent. So they would get the better results, better outcomes. Now we're going to use the term, the concept we learned, right, from this slide, the dominant strategy. Because confessing is actually the dominant strategy for both Xavier and Yoshi, right? When they're both choosing confess, they're unfortunately landing at this least desired outcome. Each get 8 years. And why do I say, right, confessing is the dominant strategy for each of them, or for both of them? Let's start with the choice of remaining silent. So for Xavier, when we are remaining silent, our outcome depends on Yoshi's choices, Yoshi's decision, okay? When we're choosing silent, from Yoshi's perspective, we assume that, okay, the outcome of each case are common knowledge, right? They both know that, right, each type of choice, how many years of imprisonment they're facing, okay? So say from once Xavier chooses to remain silent, then from Yoshi's perspective, he would be able to choose between these two cases. All right, if Yoshi knows that Xavier chooses to remain silent, then Yoshi can compare his outcomes, okay, between these two cases, whether to remain silent or to confess. If Yoshi confesses while Xavier remains silent, Yushi gets 0 years. And if Yushi remains silent when Xavier remains silent, Yushi gets 1 month, which is actually more punishment than to tell on Xavier when Xavier decides to remain silent. So put it in one sentence, okay? When Xavier chooses to remain silent, Yoshi are facing these 2 options, to confess or to remain silent. And the better choice for Yushi now is to confess. And keep that in your mind, okay? When Xavier chooses to remain silent, Yoshi wants to confess. Now let's consider a second scenario. If Yoshi knows that Xavier chooses to confess, then Yoshi will be kind of forced to choosing from these 2 cases, okay? If Yoshi knows Xavier confesses already, then also confess will give Yoshi 8 years, but remaining silent will give Yoshi 10 years. So obviously, if Yoshi knows that Xavier is going to confess, Yoshi better also confess so that he could have 8 years instead of 10 years. Okay? So if we put the 2 scenarios together, then the conclusion would be no matter what Xavier chooses, the dominant strategy, the better options will always be to confess for Yoshi, which means Yoshi will always choose to confess. Okay? Now Yoshi always chooses to confess. Then what can Xavier do? Xavier has to confess as well, because if he remains silent, he'll get 10 years instead of 8 years. To control the damage, Yoshi have to confess as well in this case. So when they're making the most, each of them are making the most rational decisions, they ended up in the worst scenario. They ended up in the worst outcome situation. And if you think about, even though Yoshi chooses to remain silent, Xavier still need to confess, because if you compare these 2 cases for Xavier, right, once he knows what Yoshi chooses, confess is always still a better choice for Xavier, which means kind of symmetrically, no matter what Yoshi chooses, for Xavier, confess is always the dominant strategy. So the prisoner's dilemma is actually showing us, right? Even though when players of a game are facing a better outcome, if they could collude with each other, cooperate with each other, because their dominant strategy is to cheat, basically, right? To betray their partner. And that's to betray their partner will give them even more benefits than to collaborate or cooperate. So they always choose to cheat. And when they both choose to cheat, or in this case confess, that will lead to the worst situation for them. So that is the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so this is all we're going to cover from chapter 18, right? We mostly focus on a list of vocabularies, right? We start from introducing what is oligopoly and what is duopoly, right? And we talk about how collusion and cartel can really benefit, right? Each of the oligopolists, because they would act as one monopolist in this case. However, their cartel or collusion or trade agreement can never hold for too long. And that is because they each have the incentive to cheat, right? To betray their contracts or their agreements. And this can be actually proved, right, from the game theory model of prisoner's dilemma. And the rule, kind of the strategy we use to solve this prisoner's dilemma, right? To walk us through how each prisoner ended up both confess or both cheat. We use the concept of dominant strategy. And when we're using dominant strategy and we ended up with a situation or a choice that each player will always choose, they'll always end up there, it's called a Nash equilibrium. Okay, so that's all for this module for chapter 17 and 18, and also that's all for this semester. So I hope to give you guys more time to work on your project, the final report, and we'll have a final exam as well, right? And we'll have some assignments for this module 10. So I would like to appreciate your hard work for this semester, and I hope to see some of you in the future classes.